In 1963, a survey team walked over this hill. They found broken limestone slabs sticking out of the soil. They wrote them up, filed the report, and moved on. Somewhere in the record, the slabs got read as grave markers, and the hill became a medieval cemetery, and that was that for 30 years. Those slabs were the tops of carved stone monoliths. Some of them stand 5.5 meters and weigh in the region of 16 tons, and they were put there roughly 11,500 years ago by people with no metal, no wheel, and no pottery. That is not the case we are opening. Who built it is answered, and the answer overturned a model most of you were taught at school. The case is what happened afterwards, because somebody took these enclosures, filled them to the top with rubble, and walked away. Almost everything you have been told about this site has already been revised once, some of it twice. Stay with me, because by the end you will have 4 answers and 1 question, and the question is the one nobody can close. Start with the hill itself, because it is not a natural feature. Roughly 15 kilometers northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey, on a limestone ridge overlooking the Karahan plain, there is a mound about 15 meters high and 300 meters across. It is artificial. Everything in it was put there by people. The local name translates to something close to Potbelly Hill, and for a long time the only thing on top was a single mulberry tree that the surrounding villages treated as a place of respect. Farmers had been clearing stone off the slopes for generations, because stone in a field is a nuisance. In the early 1960s, a joint survey by Istanbul University and the University of Chicago recorded the site. They noted worked flint on the surface. They noted the broken slabs, and then the interpretation that closed the file, those slabs were most plausibly grave markers, and this was a cemetery of no great age. In their defense, the tops of these pillars do look like broken headstones. That is exactly what they look like. If you walk across a hillside in Anatolia and see slabs of dressed limestone protruding at angles from the earth, cemetery is the obvious reading, and it is the correct reading almost every single time. This was the exception. And it stayed the exception, filed and unvisited, for 3 decades. Which is the part I keep coming back to. The most important archaeological site of the 20th century sat in a filing cabinet with a wrong label on it, and the only thing standing between it and discovery was somebody bothering to read the paperwork again. Eventually somebody did. Klaus Schmidt was a German archaeologist working with the German Archaeological Institute, and in the early 1990s, he was doing something very ordinary. He was looking for a site. He had been excavating in the region already. He was reading through old survey reports, the way you do when you want to find somewhere worth digging that nobody has committed to yet. He came across the 1963 notes, and what caught him was not the cemetery interpretation. It was the worked flint, and the description of the limestone, and the fact that the two did not sit comfortably together. He went to look, and the accounts of that visit all agree on the same thing. It did not take him long. Within a very short time on that hillside, he understood that the slabs were not headstones, that the mound was artificial, and that whatever was underneath was Neolithic and enormous. He is reported to have said afterwards that he had a simple choice that day: walk away and say nothing, or spend the rest of his life there. That is not a dramatic flourish. It is an accurate description of what excavating a site of this size commits you to. A tell 300 meters across, dug by hand, at the pace archaeology actually moves, is not a project. It is a career, and you will not finish it. He started excavating in 1995, working with the Şanlıurfa Museum, and he did in fact spend the rest of his life there. He died in 2014, so this is a cold case in the most literal sense available. A file opened, misread, closed, and left, reopened 30 years later by one man rereading somebody else's discarded notes. And what came out of the ground in the years that followed did not just add a site to the map. It broke a model, the inventory. Cut into the mound are enclosures, roughly circular and oval, built from stone walls with benches running around the inside. Set into those walls, at intervals, are T-shaped limestone pillars, standing upright, facing inward. And in the middle of each enclosure stand 2 more pillars, considerably larger than the rest, parallel to one another. The ring pillars run around 3 to 4 meters. The central pairs in the best preserved enclosures reach about 5.5 meters, and weight estimates for the largest run up to around 16 tons. Treat those tonnages as estimates calculated from measured volume rather than figures anybody has put on a scale, because that is what they are. 16 tons is a loaded city bus, standing upright, in a socket cut into bedrock. The oldest of these enclosures date to roughly the 10th millennium before the Common Era, around 11,500 years ago. Now here is the anchor that does more work than any other number in this episode, and I want you to sit with it rather than let it slide past. Stonehenge is about 5,000 years old. Göbekli Tepe is more than 11,000. which means the distance in time between Göbekli Tepe and Stonehenge is greater than the distance between Stonehenge and you. When the first ditch was being dug on Salisbury Plain, this site had already been buried and forgotten for longer than Stonehenge has existed since. There is a second layer on this hill, and it is the part almost nobody mentions, which is a shame because it may be the saddest thing on the site. Above and after the great round enclosures comes a later phase. The buildings change. They become rectangular rather than circular. They become smaller. And the pillars in them are smaller too, sometimes very much smaller, until in places they are barely more than a gesture at the shape. The same people, or their descendants, in the same place, doing the same thing on a diminishing scale. Whatever drove the first enclosures was running out. Nobody knows why. Population change, climate, a shift in belief, the ordinary exhaustion of an idea that lasted 1,000 years. But the record on that hill is not a story of steady progress. It is a peak, and then a long decline, and then nothing. One more figure, and it governs everything that follows. Ground-penetrating survey indicates many more enclosures still under the soil, and a great many more pillars. Commonly cited estimates put the excavated proportion at around 5%. So every conclusion in this episode is provisional. 95% of the evidence in this case is still in the ground. But the 5% we have contains a detail that most coverage skips entirely. Look at the shape again. A tall vertical shaft with a broad horizontal block across the top, forming a T. The obvious reading is architectural, a post and a lintel, something structural or something that used to hold a roof. Now walk around to the side. Running down the length of the shaft, carved in low relief, are arms, bent at the elbow, and they come round to the front, where two hands meet across the lower body, fingers extended and carefully carved. Some of these figures wear belts. At least one carries what reads as an animal pelt hanging at the front, worked in stone. The belts carry repeated symbols, geometric and deliberate, which nobody has been able to read because reading them would require a language, and we have no language from these people at all. And the horizontal block on top is a head, faceless, not eroded, not damaged, not unfinished, blank on purpose. These are not pillars. They are figures, stylized, abstracted, standing upright with their hands folded. Now put the arrangement back together. A ring of these figures, shoulder to shoulder around the inside of a circular enclosure, all facing inward, and in the center, two of them, larger than all the others, standing side by side. That is a gathering. Somebody carved a meeting and then built a room around it. Who is standing in the middle is the question, and it is not one the stones answer. Ancestors, deities, clan founders, something we do not have a word for. The faces were left blank, and the blankness may itself be the point. But the figures are not alone in these enclosures. Carved across their bodies and around their sides is a menagerie, and once you look at what is in it, it gets stranger. Take an inventory of the carvings. Foxes, boars with tusks, snakes in numbers, sometimes in whole writhing panels, scorpions, spiders, vultures, cranes, aurochs, the enormous wild cattle that Europe and the Near East used to have and no longer does, wild asses, big cats. Now take an inventory of what these people actually ate. We have that because we have the bone. Tens of thousands of animal bones have come out of this site, and they are food waste. And what dominates that assemblage is gazelle. Gazelle barely appears in the art. Read those two lists side by side, and something is obviously going on. The animals carved onto these stones are overwhelmingly the dangerous, the venomous, the predatory, and the scavenging. The animal they actually hunted, killed, and ate in the greatest numbers is nearly absent from the walls. Whatever these carvings are, they are not a record of the hunt, and they are not an inventory of the larder. Nobody carved 16 tons of limestone to commemorate lunch. The best that can be said honestly is that this is a symbolic system with rules, that the rules select for danger and for death, and that we cannot read it. Vultures in particular recur, and vultures in that part of the world are associated across later cultures with the treatment of the dead, but connecting an 11,000-year-old carving to a practice documented thousands of years afterwards is a chain of inference, not a finding. One pillar deserves a specific mention, because you will have seen it. It carries a vulture with a wing raised over a round object, a scorpion, and a headless human figure. A small number of researchers have argued this is a dated record of a comet impact at the start of the Younger Dryas cold period, encoded astronomically. The archaeologists who excavated the site published a response rejecting it, on grounds including the animal imagery being consistent with the symbolic vocabulary used across the whole site, rather than a star map, and the difficulty of the proposed dating method. I am not going to mock the idea. It is a serious attempt at a hard problem. It is also a minority position that the specialists working the ground do not accept, and you should know that when you see the pillar in a thumbnail. The carvings are one problem. Getting the stones there in the first place is another one entirely. The limestone came from the plateau immediately around the site. You can walk it. The quarries are right there, which is the one piece of good news in the whole operation. Everything else about it is bad news. No metal tools. This is thousands of years before copper. The pillars were cut from bedrock using flint and harder stone, hammering and picking a channel around the outline of the block until it could be levered free. No wheel. That is not a small point. The wheel does not appear for another 6,000 years or so, which means every single one of these pillars was moved by dragging, levering, rolling on logs, or some combination, over open ground. No draft animals in harness. There is no ox team here. There is no horse. There are only people, rope, timber, and stone. And then, lying in the quarry, unfinished, still partly joined to the bedrock it was being cut from, there is a monolith around 7 meters long that has been estimated in the region of 50 tons. 3 times the weight of the largest one they actually stood up. Cut out on 3 sides, abandoned where it lay. Anyone who has run a job will recognize that decision, and there is something quite comforting about it across 11,500 years. Somebody looked at what they had started, did the arithmetic, and stopped. Now do the arithmetic they were doing, because it leads somewhere the carvings do not. Take one of the 16-ton pillars. Estimates for dragging loads of that order on timber rollers or a sledge over prepared ground vary widely with the assumptions, but every serious attempt lands in the same territory. You are talking about a workforce in the high dozens at absolute minimum, and realistically well over 100 people hauling in coordination, plus more cutting rollers, more clearing the route, more managing the ropes. And that is one pillar. The enclosures contain rings of them, with the 2 big ones in the middle, and there are many enclosures. So the labor force is not a family group, it is not a hunting band, it is a large number of people working together on a task with no immediate return in food for an extended period. Which means somebody had to feed them. That is the thread to hold, because it is the one that runs through the rest of this episode. You cannot organize that many people on a hilltop without a food supply, and you cannot supply that much food by hunting alone, indefinitely, in one place. The stones are not just evidence of belief, they are evidence of a catering problem, and the catering problem is what broke the textbook. If that sounds familiar, it should. There is a block of similar character lying in a quarry at Baalbek in Lebanon, 9,000 years later, for what may have been exactly the same reason. Ambition is older than the wheel. So they could quarry it, carve it, move it, and raise it. Which brings us to the part that broke a century of archaeological consensus. Because the question is not whether they could do this. It is who they were. You were taught a sequence. Most people over 40 in the English-speaking world were taught it, and it went like this. First, agriculture. People stop following herds and start planting. Second, surplus. Farming produces more food than the farmers need. Third, settlement, because you have to stay near the fields. Fourth, specialists, because surplus food frees people from finding food. And fifth, at the end of the chain, the things specialists make. Cities, priesthoods, writing, monuments, farming first, temples last. Göbekli Tepe arrives in the wrong order. It is monumental, coordinated, labor-intensive construction produced by people who were, at minimum, still substantially hunting and foraging. Klaus Schmidt's reading was a straight inversion. His formulation, roughly, was that first came the temple and then came the city, that the gathering, and whatever belief drove it, came first, and that the pressure of feeding large numbers of people repeatedly in one place is part of what pushed them toward cultivating grain. Now the correction, and it matters, because the internet version of this site overstates it badly. You will hear that Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture by 6,000 years. It does not. This site sits in the pre-pottery Neolithic. That is precisely the window in which the earliest cultivation was emerging in this region. And the detail that makes it remarkable, rather than impossible, genetic work tracing the ancestry of domesticated einkorn wheat points to wild populations on the Karahan range, which is a short distance away, roughly 30 kilometers. The wheat was being domesticated next door at the same time. So this is not a monument built 6,000 years before farming by people who had no idea it was coming. It is a monument built at the exact moment farming was beginning, by people who were living through that transition, possibly driving it. The 6,000 years is the gap to Stonehenge. Keep the number, move it to the right comparison, and it is a stronger fact than the wrong version ever was. That is the first case closed. It is not the only thing about this site that has been revised. It was never a temple with no town. For about 2 decades, the story that reached the public was a specific and very attractive one. A temple in the wilderness. No houses, no settlement, no domestic life. A sanctuary that hunter-gatherer bands traveled to, gathered at, built, and left. The first temple, built by people who had no town for it to serve. That was Schmidt's interpretation, and it should be credited to him as an interpretation rather than repeated as an established fact, because the evidence that has come out of the ground since has complicated it substantially. The excavation found water cisterns cut into the bedrock, rock-cut basins for collecting and holding rainwater, with a total capacity running to well over 100 cubic meters. Think about what a cistern implies. There is no spring on that hill. There is no river. The nearest reliable water is a walk away and down, which is fine if you are passing through and a serious problem if you are not. You cut a cistern out of solid rock because people are going to be there long enough and often enough that carrying water up a hill every day has stopped being acceptable. Storing rainwater is not something you build for a weekend. It is infrastructure, and infrastructure is what you install when you have decided to stay. That single detail does more damage to the pilgrimage picture than anything else recovered from the site. Then the grinding equipment, not a few pieces. Very large quantities of grinding stones and processing tools, alongside big limestone vessels, some of them substantial enough to hold well over 100 liters. There has been serious published discussion of large-scale food preparation and possibly fermentation, which is to say, feasting on an organized scale. And structures that read as domestic rather than ceremonial have been identified in the later work. The picture that is emerging now, and I want to stress, this is live and still moving, is less a temple with no town and more a place where people lived and worked and gathered, which contains some very special buildings. That is a smaller headline. It may also be a more interesting one, because a settlement that builds monumental communal architecture at the dawn of agriculture is a different and richer thing than a shrine in an empty landscape. And there is one more assumption from those first 2 decades that has not survived at all. For years, the framing was that this site is unique, a solitary anomaly, one inexplicable hill. It is not remotely. Survey and excavation across the surrounding region of southeastern Turkey has now identified a whole group of related sites from the same culture and the same broad period, and the work is ongoing under a coordinated program with a name that translates roughly as the Stone Hills. The most striking of them is Karahan Tepe, around 35 kilometers away, under excavation since 2019. What has come out of Karahan Tepe is astonishing on its own terms. A chamber with a row of pillars that were not quarried and transported at all. They were carved directly out of the living bedrock, left standing where the surrounding rock was cut away from around them, and set into the wall of that chamber, emerging from the rock, is a carved human head. Notice what that changes technically. At Göbekli Tepe, the problem is transport. Cut the stone, move it, raise it, socket it. At Karahan Tepe, the problem is the opposite one. Nothing moves. You remove everything that is not the pillar, working downward, and there is no undo. Get it wrong, and you have destroyed the thing you were making. 2 sites, 35 kilometers apart, same culture, same period, solving the same architectural idea by opposite methods. That is not 2 isolated marvels. That is a tradition with variation in it, which is what traditions look like. Other sites in the group have produced narrative relief carving, human figures and animals arranged in what looks like a scene rather than a symbol set, which, if the reading holds, is storytelling in stone thousands of years before writing. So, the anomaly dissolves. This is not one impossible hill. It is a regional culture, with a shared architectural vocabulary, a shared symbolic system, and multiple monumental sites, spread across a landscape. Göbekli Tepe is not the exception. It is the one we found first, and regular viewers will recognize the shape of that, because it is exactly what happened in Case File 001. The Antikythera mechanism looked like a lone, impossible object, and turned out to be the single survivor of a tradition that written sources told us about all along. Same logic, different century. Anomalies are usually just the first member of a set, which leaves us with one question, the one in the title. The one nobody can close here is the condition the enclosures were found in, full, packed to the top with rubble, limestone fragments, flint debris, animal bone, sediment. The pillars were standing where they had been placed, in remarkably good condition, surrounded and covered by fill. That condition is the reason we have this site at all. Buried stone does not weather. Buried stone does not get carted off for field walls. The exceptional preservation here is a direct consequence of the enclosures being underneath something. Schmidt's reading was that this was deliberate. Intentional burial. Structures that had served their purpose being formally decommissioned and interred, filled in on purpose by the people who built them, possibly as an act with meaning rather than a disposal. That interpretation is where the popular version of this site stops, and it is an arresting image. A people who built something enormous and then chose to bury it. Now the honest complication, and this is the part the documentaries leave out, Researchers working the site since have questioned whether it was one deliberate act at all. The argument is that the fill is not uniform, that some of it is consistent with structural collapse, that material washes downslope on a hillside over long periods, and that occupation debris accumulates around and into abandoned structures without anybody intending anything by it. Under that reading, the enclosures were not buried. They filled up. So lay the candidates on the table properly. 1. Ritual decommissioning. The enclosures were closed on purpose, as an act, in the way you might retire something that had done its work. 2. Abandonment and collapse. The structures failed or were left, and the hillside did the rest over centuries. 3. Gradual accumulation. Continuous occupation nearby, with debris and sediment building up in and around structures no longer in use. 4. And probably the most realistic. Some combination of all of them, at different enclosures, at different times, over a period of use that ran for well over 1,000 years. I am not going to pick one for you, because the evidence does not currently support picking one, and I would rather tell you that than make something up. But here is what makes this different from most of the cases on this channel, and it is the closest thing to good news I can offer. Around 5% of this site has been excavated. Whatever the answer is, it is very probably still sitting in the ground, 95% of it untouched, on a hill in southeastern Turkey. This is not a case that is unsolvable. It is a case where the evidence has not been recovered yet, and the people digging it now will very likely settle it in our lifetimes. So the verdict on case file 002. 4 questions answered, and every one of them answered against the version you were told. They could build it. It did not predate farming. It was not a temple standing alone in an empty world, and it was never the only one. The one question left is the one the builders themselves would have found easiest to answer, and it is the only one they did not write down anywhere we can read. 2 ways to see it, and I think both are defensible. Either the burial was reverence, a deliberate sealing of something considered too significant to leave exposed, or it was closure, in the plainest sense, and they filled it in the way you fill a grave rather than the way you build a vault. Tell me which one you land on in the comments. I have changed my mind about it twice. If you got something out of this, a like helps more than you would think, and subscribe if you want the rest of the case files. Next time, case file 003, Puma Punku, in Bolivia. The site the internet insists is 15,000 years old, and the radiocarbon evidence that says something very different.